Hey there, incredible listeners. You've got an eye for great stories, and today's is one you won't want to miss. Picture this: Daniel Carter, a powerhouse CEO running a thriving restaurant empire, suddenly discovers that one of his locations is in complete chaos. But instead of sending inspectors or issuing warnings, he does the unthinkable. He goes undercovers a toxic manager, neglected staff, and a workplace on the brink of disaster. But here's the twist. He doesn't just stand by, he takes action, shaking up the leadership, rewarding the real hard workers, and turning the restaurant into a thriving success. Stay tuned as we take you inside this jaw-dropping journey of leadership, accountability, and a game-changing transformation. Daniel Carter sat in his office, staring at the latest customer service reports with growing frustration. On the surface, his fast food chain, Carter's Grill and Diner, seemed to be thriving. Sales were steady, expansion plans were moving forward, and financials looked strong. But the customer reviews told a different story. Complaints about rude staff, slow service, and poor food quality had been increasing for months. Every time Daniel brought it up with his district managers, he got the same answer: it's just a few bad days. But the negative reviews kept piling up, and his gut told him something was seriously wrong. Daniel had built this company from a single diner 15 years ago into a chain of 12 locations. In the beginning, he had been hands-on with every aspect. He knew his employees, greeted customers daily, and made sure his diners ran smoothly. But as the company expanded, he had to delegate more responsibilities, relying on managers and reports instead of first-hand experience. Somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with what was really happening on the ground. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel decided to go undercover. Instead of visiting as the CEO, he would apply as a new kitchen trainee at one of his worst-performing locations, a bustling suburban restaurant that had received the most complaints in recent months. He knew that if he walked in as the boss, employees would be on their best behavior. But as a low-level worker, he'd see the real story. To avoid recognition, he ditched his usual suit and went for a basic uniform, a baseball cap, and a fake name, Mike Dawson. Using an alias, he applied for an entry-level kitchen job online and was quickly hired without an interview, which was already a red flag. The next day, he arrived at the restaurant, heart pounding with anticipation. As soon as he stepped inside, he immediately sensed tension. The place was noisy, chaotic, and disorganized. Customers waited impatiently at the counter, some checking their watches, others looking visibly frustrated. Behind the counter, employees scrambled to keep up, but there was no clear leadership. The shift manager, a middle-aged man named Tony, stood near the office door, arms crossed, doing nothing to help. Daniel had only been inside for less than a minute, but he already knew this was going to be worse than he expected. As Daniel stepped behind the counter for his first shift, the disorganization became even more apparent. The kitchen was a mess. Grease stains covered the floor, ingredients were scattered across prep stations, and dirty trays piled up near the sinks. The air smelled of burnt fries, and the staff moved frantically, clearly overwhelmed. The front counter was no better. Customers waited impatiently, glancing at their watches as orders took far too long to come out. Daniel immediately noticed a serious staffing issue. Only 2 employees were taking orders and preparing food during what was clearly the lunchtime rush. His first interaction with the team was far from welcoming. Tony, the manager, barely acknowledged his presence, waving him off with a muttered, "Just follow Sophie, try not to slow her down." There was no introduction, no training, just an expectation that he'd figure things out. Daniel turned to Sophie, the young woman he'd been assigned to shadow, and quickly realized she was doing the work of 3 people. She bounced between flipping burgers, checking the fryer, and assembling orders, all while responding to customer complaints with calm professionalism. Meanwhile, Ethan, the cashier, was struggling to keep up. A frustrated customer at the front counter slammed his receipt down. "I've been waiting 20 minutes for a simple burger and fries. What's taking so long?" Ethan, clearly flustered, glanced toward the kitchen. "I'm really sorry, sir, we're just a bit behind." Tony, who had been standing off to the side doing absolutely nothing, suddenly decided to step in, but instead of helping, he snapped at Ethan. "Tell them they can wait like everyone else. We're short-staffed. It's not our fault." Daniel watched as Ethan swallowed his frustration and forced a smile. "I'll check on your order right now, sir." He quickly turned away, muttering under his breath. Daniel gritted his teeth. He had expected to see some issues, but this was worse than he imagined. There was no teamwork, no communication, and worst of all, no leadership. Tony seemed more interested in barking orders than actually stepping in to help. Employees like Sophie and Ethan were carrying the weight of the entire shift, while their manager refused to take responsibility. Daniel continued observing, listening, and mentally taking notes. He wasn't here to blow his cover just yet, but it was already clear that serious changes needed to happen. Behind the scenes, service and management problems. 450 words. As the shift continued, Daniel got a deeper look at the dysfunction happening behind the scenes. The kitchen was in a constant state of chaos, with orders piling up faster than they could be prepared. The grill station was understaffed, meaning burgers were being rushed and often undercooked or overcooked. The fryer station wasn't any better. Fries sat under a heat lamp for far too long, leading to complaints about cold food. The biggest problem, however, wasn't just the lack of staff. It was the lack of leadership. Tony, the manager, barely lifted a finger the entire shift. He spent most of his time standing near the office door, scrolling on his phone or criticizing employees instead of helping them. When a customer came back to complain about a missing item in their order, Tony didn't apologize or fix the mistake. Instead, he waved them off. "You probably took it and forgot. We don't give out free food just because people claim we messed up." The customer, clearly offended, shook their head in frustration and walked out. Daniel was stunned. Not only was Tony dismissive toward customers, but he also actively discouraged employees from providing good service. When Sophie tried to offer an extra side of fries to a frustrated customer whose order had been delayed, Tony scolded her in front of everyone. "This isn't charity. If they wanted more fries, they should have paid for them." Sophie bit her lip and said nothing, but Daniel could see the frustration in her eyes. Meanwhile, Ethan was being stretched to his limit at the register. At one point, the soda machine ran out of syrup, and when he asked Tony if he could step away for a second to change it, Tony scoffed. "Figure it out later, it's not that important." Ethan sighed, shaking his head, clearly used to being ignored. As Daniel continued working, it became obvious why this location had so many complaints. The employees weren't bad at their jobs, they were just completely unsupported. Tony had created an environment where employees were overworked, customers were ignored, and no one cared about improving the situation. By the time the shift ended, Daniel had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. The problem wasn't just inefficiency, it was a toxic workplace culture that started from the top, and if Tony thought this was acceptable, he was in for a rude awakening. Change was coming, but first, Daniel needed to see how bad things could get. The final straw came during the dinner rush when a frustrated customer stormed up to the counter, receipt in hand, face red with anger. "I've been waiting for 30 minutes for a simple order, and now my burger is cold, my fries are soggy, and my drink is flat. This is ridiculous," he snapped, slamming his tray onto the counter. Ethan, already overwhelmed, tried to defuse the situation. "I'm really sorry, sir, let me—" Before he could finish, Tony sauntered over, looking annoyed. Without even glancing at the order or offering a solution, he rolled his eyes. "Look, we're busy. If you don't like it, go somewhere else." The customer's jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me? That's how you treat people?" Tony shrugged. "We don't have time to cater to every little complaint." Daniel felt his blood boil. Enough was enough. He stepped forward, still playing the role of the new trainee. "Maybe if you actually helped your team instead of standing around, we wouldn't be this backed up," Daniel said, his tone calm but firm. Tony turned to him, expression hardening. "What did you just say?" Daniel met his glare. "I said maybe, if you did your job, we wouldn't have these problems." The entire restaurant went silent. Sophie and Ethan froze, eyes wide, and a few customers leaned in, sensing something bigger happening. Tony let out a dry laugh. "Oh, so the new guy thinks he knows better than me? Listen, kid, I've been running this place for years. If you don't like how things are done, you can leave." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had seen enough. The complete disregard for employees, the mistreatment of customers, the sheer arrogance. It all made sense now. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and then said, "You're right about one thing. I don't like how things are done here." And that's exactly why this is about to change. Tony frowned. What the hell are you talking about? Daniel looked around at the staff, then back at Tony. It was time to reveal the truth. With a steady voice, he said, "Because I'm not just some trainee. I'm Daniel Carter, the owner of this company." The restaurant fell into absolute silence. For a moment, the entire restaurant was silent. Tony's face went pale as the realization hit him. Sophie, Ethan, and the rest of the staff exchanged shocked glances, while customers in the dining area leaned in, sensing they were witnessing something big. Tony forced out a laugh, though his voice betrayed his unease. "You're joking, right? There's no way." Daniel didn't blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his company ID, and placed it on the counter. "Believe me now." Tony's confidence crumbled. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time all day, he had nothing to say. Daniel turned away from him, facing the employees instead. His voice was firm but calm. "I came here because I needed to see for myself what was happening in my stores. And now I have." He paused, glancing around the kitchen, the chaotic environment a direct result of poor leadership. "What I've seen is unacceptable. Not just the disorganization, but the way people have been treated." His gaze landed on Sophie. "Sophie, I've watched you keep this kitchen running with almost no support. You've dealt with a never-ending rush, fixed mistakes that weren't yours, and handled problems that your manager should have been solving." He shook his head. "That's real leadership. And it's time you get recognized for it." Sophie's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Starting Monday, you're being promoted to shift supervisor with a raise. This team needs real leadership, and I think you're the right person to help rebuild what's been broken." Ethan clapped first, then the rest of the staff joined in. Sophie blinked, clearly overwhelmed, then smiled, a mix of relief and disbelief. Then Daniel turned back to Tony. His tone hardened. "As for you, Tony, you've made it clear you have no respect for your employees or customers. You've created a toxic work environment, and I refuse to let that continue." Tony swallowed hard. "Wait, hold on, Daniel cut him off. "You're done here. Effective immediately, you're fired." Tony's face turned red with anger, but there was nothing he could do. He stormed toward the back office, muttering curses under his breath. Daniel turned to the staff. "I know things have been rough, but that changes today. I'm going to make sure this restaurant, and every other location, is a place where people actually want to work." The tension in the room finally lifted. For the first time all day, there was something new in the air: hope. With Tony gone, the tension that had filled the restaurant all day finally lifted. The staff exchanged uncertain glances, still in shock at what had just happened. Sophie, standing frozen near the fry station, looked as though she couldn't quite process what Daniel had just said. Daniel turned to her with a reassuring nod. "Sophie, you've kept this kitchen running with almost no support, and it's time that hard work is rewarded. Your promotion to shift supervisor starts immediately." Sophie's eyes widened. I don't know what to say." Daniel smiled. "Say yes. You've earned this." The other employees clapped and cheered, and Sophie finally let out a breath, nodding. "Yes, thank you. I won't let you down." Next, Daniel turned to Ethan. "Ethan, I saw how you handled frustrated customers today. You kept your patience even when you were left to manage the counter alone. I'm giving you a raise, and from now on, we're adding an extra person to every shift so you're never stuck handling rush hour alone." Ethan blinked in disbelief. "Seriously? A raise?" Daniel grinned. "Seriously, and we're not stopping there." He turned to the rest of the team. "I know you've all been doing your best in a bad situation, and that's on us as leadership. So, here's what's changing. Starting next week, we're restructuring how shifts are scheduled, making sure we're fully staffed during peak hours. No more being overwhelmed and understaffed. We're also launching a proper training program so no one gets thrown into the deep end without support." The relief in the room was immediate. Employees exchanged excited whispers, and some even looked genuinely hopeful for the first time. Daniel let that moment sink in before continuing. "One last thing, we're setting up an anonymous feedback system. If something isn't working, if a manager isn't doing their job, I want to hear about it before it turns into a problem. Sophie, still processing everything, shook her head in disbelief. I never thought this place could actually change. Daniel smiled. It's changing now. And this is just the beginning. For the first time since stepping into the restaurant, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen before. Genuine optimism. 2 weeks later, Daniel walked into the restaurant once again, this time as himself. No disguise, no undercover role, just the CEO checking in to see if the changes he'd implemented had truly made a difference. The transformation was immediate. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed a completely different energy. The place felt organized, lively, and efficient. The kitchen, which had once been chaotic, now ran smoothly. Orders were coming out quickly, food was prepared properly, and the team worked together like a well-oiled machine. The once overwhelmed front counter had 2 cashiers instead of 1, ensuring customers were helped without long waits. At the register, Ethan stood confidently, taking orders with ease. When a customer had a special request, instead of looking panicked, he simply called over another worker for assistance, ensuring a smooth process. He spotted Daniel and grinned. "Hey, boss! Didn't expect to see you today." Daniel smiled. That was the point. I wanted to see how things are running without anyone feeling like they had to be on their best behavior just because I was coming in. Ethan laughed. "Well, I think you'll like what you see." Daniel turned toward the kitchen, where Sophie was now leading the shift. With her new role as shift supervisor, she had stepped up in a big way. She moved confidently between stations, checking in with employees, making sure orders were prepared correctly, and even jumping in to help during busy moments. When one of the newer team members struggled with the fry station, Sophie calmly guided them through the process. No yelling, no panic, just solid leadership. Daniel approached her as she was reviewing inventory sheets. "Sophie, this place is night and day compared to 2 weeks ago." Sophie smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "It's been a lot of work, but honestly, it feels good to finally have a team that works together instead of just trying to survive the shift." Daniel nodded. "And how do you feel in your new role?" Sophie grinned. "Like I should have been doing this all along." The final confirmation came from the customers. People were enjoying their meals, chatting happily, and no one was complaining about slow service or wrong orders. It was exactly the kind of environment Daniel had always envisioned for his restaurants. As he stood back and watched his team in action, he felt a sense of pride. The changes weren't just temporary fixes. This was a new standard. As Daniel stepped out of the restaurant, he took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction of the moment sink in. 2 weeks ago, this location had been a disaster. Poor leadership, unhappy employees, and frustrated customers. Now it was a thriving, well-managed restaurant, and the difference was undeniable. The team worked together, employees felt valued, and customers were actually enjoying their experience. But more than just fixing one location, this experience had taught Daniel a valuable lesson. Numbers on a spreadsheet didn't tell the whole story. Revenue reports might have looked stable, but the reality on the ground had been very different. Leadership wasn't about delegation alone. It was about staying connected, ensuring that company values weren't just words in a handbook, but actions seen in every shift. Before leaving, Daniel gathered Sophie, Ethan, and the rest of the team. "I want you all to know something," he said, looking around the restaurant. "The work you've done here is incredible. You've taken a broken system and rebuilt it into something stronger, and that's because of you, not me." Sophie smiled, still getting used to being in a leadership role. "Well, it helps to actually have support now." Daniel nodded. "And you'll keep having it? This isn't just about fixing one restaurant. I'm taking what I've learned here and making changes across every location." He then announced 2 major initiatives. First, quarterly undercover visits at all locations, not to catch people making mistakes, but to make sure leadership was truly supporting their teams. Second, an anonymous employee feedback system, ensuring that no one would feel unheard again. Ethan grinned. "You really mean it, huh?" Daniel smirked. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." As he walked out, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had started this company because he loved great food and great service, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what really mattered: the people. That wouldn't happen again. This wasn't just about fixing mistakes. It was about building something better, stronger, and lasting. And this time he would make sure every employee at every restaurant knew they mattered. The biggest lesson from this story is that leadership isn't just about managing from a distance. It's about staying connected to the people who make a business run. Daniel realized that numbers don't tell the full story and that poor management can destroy morale, efficiency, and customer satisfaction. By going undercover, he saw firsthand how toxic leadership affected his employees and customers. Real change happens when leaders listen, support, and take action. This experience taught him that a thriving business isn't just about profits. It's about valuing employees, fostering teamwork, and creating a culture where everyone can succeed.